I hear. Making me nervous. Hi, everyone. This is just a quick introduction. Thank you all for coming. This event tonight is an outgrowth of our retreat, which was, is it a year and a half ago? But we're still getting done what we said we would done after the results of that retreat, which I think was clean up the scheduling system, reduce burnout, and put more emphasis on making the promotions process more transparent. And tonight is part of that. So I want to thank Danny Laskowitz, JT, Maria Perona, and Pam Neville for working on setting this thing up tonight. My understanding is this is going to be recorded, so you can, watch it later on and hear what we said. It's not being live Zoomed. And I also want to thank all the speakers for their time and effort and interest in this. And for all of the assistant professors here, what you need to understand is we are desperate to promote you. This is not a system where we're trying to keep anyone down. I feel great about everyone who's promoted, and I feel at Duke, everyone can be promoted. And tonight we're here to tell you the things you have to done and the different tracks that require different requirements so that we can make it easy and transparent on all of you. And I will come back at the end to talk. All right, Danny, it's all yours.
Where are you?
I am. Okay, well, thank you for coming. I'd feel more comfortable if we kept this informal. So please, if anyone has a question, call out. For the people on Zoom, I'm not sure there is anybody, but if you're on Zoom, maybe just add the comment and we'll kind of adjudicate it and read it out loud.
No, we are doing it live. There's just no one there.
Yes. Okay, so let me start by saying I stole this graphic off the internet because when I was first asked to become chair of APT committee, I felt very uncomfortable. I thought it was some kind of cloistered backroom committee that was judging other people. I never liked it when I was in that position, and I didn't really like being part of that. But the idea here is that it's really not the idea that there's some committee that is making decisions on different people, but rather they're rising up together as a department. Throughout the spectrum of junior faculty to later faculty to research to clinical, we now have changed the representation of the APT committee. We try to be transparent. And I think across the spectrum, we're trying to kind of raise ourselves up as a department. So first of all, let me try to demystify the process. So why is it so confusing? And the problem is, of course, that we're all taking different career paths, right? Some of us are more clinically oriented, some are more in the lab, some do a combination of both. The institution totally revamped the entire APT process. So for those of you not aware, 3 years ago, there were 5 tracks and it was hopelessly complicated. Tracks 1 through 3 were tenure track, 4 and 5 were non-tenure track. It was somewhat arbitrary. So the institution said, let's just divide this into a career track and a tenure track. And that's what we have now. The problem is you could either be a lumper or a splitter. It's kind of like ALS, right? It doesn't make the disease process any less confusing. So yes, there are 2 tracks, a career and a clinical track, but there are sub-tracks in each of these. And I'm going to try to demystify it. It's a hard, there's a lot of nuance to this, but I'll do my best to at least get the resources and the key points so you know kind of where you stand in the process and where to go for advice. Another issue, by the way, is internal institutional consistency versus departmental prerogative. That is, we don't make up our own rules. Duke, as the institution, makes up rules that we have to abide by. Now, we can tailor it and adjust it and try to right size it for neurology, but we have to stay within the bounds of what Duke tells us we have to do. And I think even the definition of scholarship is changing. I mean, I think gone are the days where we used to manuscript count, right? Like there was a manuscript threshold, and if you hit this many, you got promoted. The whole definition of scholarship is changing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And the thing is, these are high stakes, right? I mean, sometimes the stakes are higher symbolically than they are tangibly. That is, getting promoted may not change your career definition, how much you get paid, what your responsibilities are, but it means a lot, right? And often there are politics and it gets bitter. So we're trying to bypass all this. This was attributed to Wallace Sayre. Some of you may be familiar. Academic politics is the most vicious because the stakes are so low, right? At the end of the day, it may not make much of a concrete difference, but it does mean a lot to people. So what we're trying to do is just make standard, transparent guidelines, maintain consistency with other clinical departments. And there's a few key messages that I'd like to get across. The first is that the role of the division chiefs are central, right? So we have an APT committee, but at every step, whether it's the annual review, whether it's actually recommending people for promotion, the division chiefs know their divisions better than anybody. They're the ones who come to us when someone's ready to be promoted. They write the nomination letter. They're interacting directly with the faculty to talk about how time is going to be divided. So please recognize that. If there's any questions, please go to the division chiefs. And we're going to talk about a process of annual evaluation, which now takes place, and the fact that the division chiefs actually work closely with the APT committee. This is the APT committee, and it used to be, just full tenured professors, but now we have more clinically oriented people. We have people who are assistant professor, associate professor. We have fellowship directors. We're trying to really encompass the whole spectrum of the department to make things more transparent. So this comes directly from the institutional guidelines. So I'm going to kind of take you through the process of APT. When you first come, you come either as to a clinical department like ours, as a medical instructor or an assistant professor. And we had some arbitrariness of this. So what we decided is that if you're subspecialty trained, in general, you start as an assistant professor. You're undifferentiated. You're not either tenure or non-tenure. You're an assistant professor undifferentiated. After about 5 years, you're supposed to have the conversation in conjunction with your division chief and with the APT committee, whether you differentiate into a career track or a tenure track. So at that point, you can either become an associate professor without tenure, but in a tenure track, right? So that means you continue your trajectory, and by year 11, we expect that you'll probably get tenure, or you can move to a career track. And there's no cadence to this. This could take as long as it takes. So you can be promoted to assistant or a full professor, but without tenure. In the tenure track, there's a 10-year limit. That is, by year 11, in general, you're expected to get tenure or to transition out of the tenure track. In the past 10 years, in the past several years, that has been extended because of COVID. So now there's an additional year. If there's other extenuating circumstances, medical leave, childcare, it could be extended further, but that needs to be documented. So what is the tenure track versus a career track? It's the first big decision that people have to make. Tenure track is designed more for scholarship and impact. So I should mention, here's another kind of key point. For both the career track and the scholarship, and the career track and the tenure track, scholarship and institutional impact are mandatory. So even in the career track, you need institutional impact. That is, I'm a division chief, I run a fellowship, take a leadership role in the clinic. But also you need some durable scholarship as well. And we'll talk about that. It's not just manuscripts, it could be other durable material. But in the tenure track, this is primarily what you're judged on. So someone who might be a tenure track who makes assistant professor and making that transition to associate professor might have their first NIH grant, their K grant, or that might be the second of several grants. It might be foundation grants and NIH grants, but they're starting to establish a clear pattern of external funding. And that is necessary for tenure track. Usually more than 30% of time is research. It can be split clinical and research, but more than 30% of time is research. And really you need substantive research funding. So again, starting out, most people in our department now start out as assistant professor. If you're subspecialty trained, there's some circumstances where it makes more sense to be an instructor. So for example, if you really want to be in the lab and do an extended fellowship and maybe not have to have committee responsibilities or have limited clinical time because you're building up your portfolio, it may make sense to do a year or two of instructor, but that's not meant to be a terminal position. That's usually just for a year or two. And most people start out as assistant professor. Some people say, well, if I'm an assistant professor and I'm not tenure track because I'm undifferentiated, does that hurt me on NIH grant applications? And the institution has suggested that the assistant professors use tenure eligible, which is, I guess, a semantic nuance saying that you're not really tenure track or non-tenure track. So again, here are the general principles of promotion. That's a very wordy slide, but institutional impact. Are you fellowship director? Are you clerkship? Do you play a primary role in clerkships? Do you play a primary role in education, administration? There's a lot of ways you can have institutional impact and scholarship. So scholarship traditionally was peer-reviewed manuscripts. We'll talk about how that definition has broadened, but for both career and tenure track, you do need to demonstrate extra institutional scholarship. So this came in the 1990s, and the institution loves this. You'll probably see this all over the institutional website. This is the expanded concept of scholarship, and the idea is we're not just counting manuscripts, right? So there's 4 domains. There's discovery, which is traditional research, integration, application, and teaching. So examples of this, discovery is what we're all used to, right? Peer review manuscripts, book chapters, you're building new knowledge. Integration might be comprehensive literature reviews reaching across departments to create integrated programs. Application, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but an example of someone who has really done application might be Rick Bedleck, right? Who's created a national name for Duke for ALS. He's been part of advocacy groups and patient advocacy and, at the national level. Teaching, this doesn't just mean being a great teacher on rounds, because hopefully we're all committed to teaching. This means that this is a significant part of your career. That is, you've instituted new curricula that you test, and you test that intervention, new instructional materials. An example of someone like this might be Len White, for example, who's done an amazing job. I think he has the #1 Coursera course in neuroscience internationally. So when he goes up for promotion, it's not just counting his peer-reviewed manuscripts, it's looking at his international impact. So what are the criteria? I think when anyone looks at your CV, and certainly when we do in the APT committee, you're looking at focus, right? It's not how many publications. It's like, is there a clear thread? Is there a continuous thread showing how you're developing a subspecialty area, kind of improving the application and understanding of medicine or biology in some clear direction? And some of that might be first author, and it's nice that you collaborate with other people, but it's not just the number of publications. Does it tell a story as you read someone's CV? And the biggest issue, I think, for most faculty at all levels is whether you're diffusing your efforts too much. And this certainly was a problem for me, right? I have a joint appointment in Singapore, and I run neuroscience medicine, the DCRI, and I run the 3rd year, and I try to run a lab, and I'm in the ICU, and I used to run the neurovascular. And I think we all suffer from this. If you're a good citizen, you get pulled in a lot of directions, and that is really what can hold you back more than anything. And that, by the way, is why it's so important that we put the division chiefs first and central, because they could help protect your time. That yes, we have a lot of good citizen responsibilities, but to keep you moving in a career trajectory that also works for you. So let's talk about, this was designed primarily for people the first few years. And again, I apologize. Back in the old days, I would meet personally with everyone. I mean, we'd sit together in grand rounds. We'd like schmooze outside grand rounds. Usually there was food. It's just in the past few years, that's not the world we live in anymore. I think we've become more isolated. So I'm embarrassed to say there's people I've talked to on the phone or maybe once or twice over Zoom, but I don't know as well. But please, one of the take-home messages is that if there's any questions about next steps where you stand, please reach out. I mean, that's one of the most positive parts of the job for me, is actually being able to talk to people. So let's talk about the first threshold. That's assistant professor to associate professor in career track. Usually that's about 5 years. And again, the institution wants that to be about 5 years. The litmus test is really a regional reputation, and evidence of scholarship is required, although institutional impact is primary for career track. But again, this is copied directly out of the institutional APT handbook. And for those of you interested, Pam has done an incredible job in setting up our website. If you go to the Department of Neurology website, there'll be faculty resources. You'll see our guidelines, you'll see the institutional guidelines. And if you really want to know the bottom line, you look at Appendix L from the clinic, which is really all the clinical department guidelines. And scholarship is critical. The way this works is they want you to show a primary focus. I'm a clinician, and we assume that we're all good clinicians, right? We're at Duke, but also a secondary domain. as well, that you're proficient in and that you add to the institution, either as a clinician educator, a clinician investigator, or a clinician administrator. So a clinician educator is more than someone who does rounds and you do seminars for your subspecialty. Everybody does that. A clinician educator is someone who's really goes above and beyond that to make education one of their primary foci. And Jordan's going to talk about that. And there's a few faculty who said, this is what I want to primarily do. I'm a clinician investigator. Lisa is going to talk a little bit about clinical research opportunities. Laurie Sanders has done a lot of work at the DCRI, but there's a lot of opportunities to do clinical research. So it doesn't mean you need to be in a lab, although if you're a PhD laboratory-based, you often are. It just means you need to be doing original research or site-based research, and there's a lot of opportunity for that. Or a clinician administrator, someone who really has devoted themselves to advancing the administration of Duke, and not just Duke again, but at a regional and national level. An example might be Lisa Pickett, for example, who's the chief medical officer of the institution, who just got promoted to associate professor. She was CMO for 10 years. So these again are the domains of effort. So most of us as clinicians, you're expected to attract clinical referrals. You're supposed to have, they will actually look at patient comments. That's going to be important. I assume that most of the people are going to be excellent clinicians here, right? That's primarily often why you were chosen. Now we have clinician educators, again, durable content that goes above and beyond the institution, new programs, you develop new curricula. Most of the people as clinician educators are expected to have Duke Ahead certification. And Suma, you might even want to talk about this later. This was set up by Diana McNeil, who's an internist here, an endocrinologist, who was the former residency director of medicine. She's wonderful, and she set up this program. But it's kind of a formal, rigorous way to learn the skill set of teaching. Clinician investigator, again, book chapters, they could be reviews, they could be consensus statements, it could be site-based research, it could be DCRI research. There's a lot of ways to get involved as a clinician investigator. So how about, so again, if you're tenure track, and there are examples, and again, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but in general, if you're at least 30%, a third of your time is research effort, and you have a clear pattern of funding, usually this means at least a K grant, like a career development award from the NIH, or from some nonprofit, AHA, or just starting to show that you can get peer-reviewed grants. A clear pattern of focus and scholarship, academic productivity. Again, it's not how many publications, but what is your trajectory? Have you really carved out something that you're adding to the medical literature? And really developing a national reputation. So this would be the first step. It would be, you'd be an assistant professor to an associate professor. You don't yet have tenure, but you're tenure track. This didn't turn out very well, but I'm not sure. So this was, I think, promotion to professor at career track. Again, that's another 5 years. So to be a professor career track, the institution has come out and said, we want you to have a national reputation. Usually that's about 5 years from associate professor. That is the litmus test. And usually these are people who sit on NIH study sections or national committee leadership. Of course, they're expected to have departmental responsibilities and demonstrate institutional educational leadership. But in clinical track, it doesn't necessarily have to be original peer review publications. That's ideal, but they could be chapters, books, people who edit books, national leadership, advocacy, durable digital work, something that gives you a national or international reputation. So again, that's a little bit wordy. Let's talk a little bit about people who are PhDs, and I know it's a minority of people in this department, but it's an important minority. That's what gives us the depth, I think, as an academic institution. So if you're a primary research focus, again, you're supposed to show excellence in that domain, and the criteria are higher if you're research focused. You're expected to have consistent grants, a pattern of grant funding, of academic productivity, impact factors looked at off an H index. But in addition to that, you still have to have that second domain, and that could be a challenge for people who are in the lab. And Carlene, I think you're going to talk after me. Maybe you can comment on some of this also. How do you educate? It's easy to be an educator, right? If you're in the ICU rounding all the time, but how do you do that in the lab? And usually what we ask is for people who are going to go on to be tenure track, that you get a secondary appointment, you have graduate students or postdoctoral students. There are people, Lori, I don't want to call you out, but who are in the lab initially, but are very successful doing clinical research, either at the DCRI, site-based level, but are actively involved. But it's more than just being in the lab. You have to show that secondary domain of clinical impact and educational impact. And again, to be a professor, you should be a national and international level as a primary PhD. Again, these are people that are committee chairs for many years of NIH study sections and really are often internationally known. Okay, what are our challenges? I want to be transparent. So we've really worked on some areas that I felt have not been transparent enough or unfair. So one of these is, again, tenure track for basic researchers. And again, I think it's important just to be honest. So in a basic science department, they get more flow through to help fund tenure. So even if you have a lapse, perhaps of funding, you can still fund tenured basic scientists. It's more of a financial issue in a clinical department. Frankly, we don't get that same flow through from the indirect costs. So it's not just an academic issue, it's also a financial issue. So when someone comes up for tenure in a basic science track, we work closely with the chair, the business manager to say, is this feasible? And also if you're a basic scientist, it becomes sometimes a little bit more difficult to have an institutional educational commitment. It's easy if you're a clinician, right? You round, you work within your division. But teaching medical school courses, residency courses can be more of a challenge if you're a PhD, but we will work with you to avail you of these opportunities, and they do exist. Mentorship, as things stand right now, and again, you can look on the website under faculty resources. Every faculty should be evaluated annually by their division chief, and you'll see the form there. And a lot of it is fillable. But there should be mentorship at the division chief level. The APT committee will periodically review as well. And every year after you're evaluated by the division chief, you go to Rich at the chair level for yearly evaluation, just to make sure you're on track. Allowing faculty with terminal degrees to obtain regular rank. This has been a personal issue for me. You know, if you're a PhD or an MD or a doctor of dentistry or even veterinary, you can move forward. But what if you're a doctor of nurse practitioner or DNP? They don't have quite the same path forward, even though they have a terminal degree. I'm not sure this is going to change, but it's something that I've been trying to work towards. The whole issue of diversity, inclusion, equity, bias, and anti-racism. And this becomes particularly important when you look at scholarship. And I think there's also on the website, the JEDI, Pam, we have that document, right? The JEDI document? Okay. Well, I think it was distributed, but we should have that also. So if you really work, for example, Andrew Spectrum might be a good example of this, you know, to make national contributions, this counts as scholarship. Defining professionalism. The whole institution just had a meeting just 2 days ago. This is going to be, you know, we talk about professionalism, but what does it mean? And what's the recourse if you're not, you know, professional? So having a definition, actually making a consensus institutional statement. We're going to hear more about this in the next few weeks to come. And again, rewarding non-academic achievements. Some people are not traditionally academic, but they contribute in enormous ways. They're go-to clinicians. They set up clinics, subspecialty fellowships. Even if they're not traditionally academic, how do you reward that type of excellence? You know, someone who makes a huge institutional impact. Here's a few take-home messages, then I'm just going to finish a few minutes early. Define yourself academically. That process has to start early. I'll tell you, personally, when I came up initially for promotion, I was already 5-6 years in, and no one told me that I was supposed to keep a list of all the talks I gave, all the educational talks. So I came up and they said, oh, just kind of recreate over the past 6 years every talk. That's really hard to do. So do this real time. Similarly, if someone says, oh, build a national reputation, you're going up, but it would really help you to build. Well, sometimes that takes years, right? You might want to be on society committees, or you might want to get mentorship. That doesn't happen overnight. So think early on where you want to be in 3, 4, 5 years. And sometimes you have to back into it because some of these things are a process. Again, you should know that there's always mentorship. You should be annually reviewed both by the division chief and the chair. Everyone on the APT committee, I can tell you personally, would love to reach out, talk about the process. That's why they're on the APT. Like we should be here as a resource. You can seek mentorship both within and outside your division. Maybe since it's something that Rich might talk about. I know that it's important to have mentorship within your division, but also sometimes it's nice to have the objective input of people outside your division, kind of a multidisciplinary input. And there's always resources available. So again, if you go to the Duke Neurology website, you can look under faculty resources. I think we're going to post this. This is at the institutional level. You can see all the rules. It is changing rapidly. The faculty handbook and the guideline for motions is now undergoing review. So what's the case now may not be in the next 6 months. And November, in case people are interested, November 17th, there's going to be a Zoom meeting at the institutional level to talk about promotions processes. And of course, our neurology departmental website, which Pam did a tremendous amount of work. And let me just say a word as I end. Pam has done Pam Neville. I don't know. Do you know everybody? Because again, maybe stand up, because maybe in this day and age, people don't even know. But Pam has done an incredible amount of work setting up the whole website, presiding over these things. We also, by the way, keep track of all the gender equity, how many publications does it matter if you're male, female, and this is also an ongoing initiative that we're going to be doing every year. So I think there's a minute or two before I hand over to Carlene, but are there any questions? Or, and it's a lot, you know, it's hard to tailor this for everybody, but at least to give an overview. Okay, well, one of the things we're doing, I'll give you some time to come up. So one of the things that we're doing now is the APT meeting has people across the spectrum of junior faculty and more senior faculty. And this all was Rich's initiative, but it's also an institutional initiative. So we're really happy to have Carlene join. Sorry.
Fashion. So no questions for Danny? Okay, so my name is Carlene Moore, and Sneha and I serve on the APT committee as ex officio members. And we both work together to put this little presentation together. But after seeing some of Danny's slides, I'm going to skip over some of mine. There are, as Danny mentioned, there are 2 tracks, tenure track and career track. And pretty much one is focused more so on scholarship and impact, tenure track, innovative contributions. And the main difference is there's a tenure clock from 10 years from assistant professor versus with career track, the timing is more flexible. And then, of course, Danny showed this, so I'm going to skip over this also. So when we're in the meetings and they're going through this DAPT process, for career track, after you submit your dossier, and then I'll go through a little bit about what do you put in your dossier. The dossier is reviewed at the quarterly DAPT meeting. And then during this meeting, the committee votes and the recommendation is either approved or deferred. And then the chair forwards this for approval to the dean and then to the APT offices, and you're promoted to the next rank. With the tenure track, there, as you can see, there are different levels of approval. After you submit your dossier, I think tenure track, it's get reviewed at the quarterly DAPT meeting, and I think the review here is a little bit much more stringent. And then the committee, the DAPT committee votes on their recommendation whether to approve and defer. And then also when it goes to the School of Medicine APT committee, there is also a vote, and there's also a vote by Dean Cloutman, the chancellor, the board of trustees, and then you're promoted to the next rank. So that's the slight difference. So when preparing for your promotion, even now as junior professors, we hear a number of questions that you should ask during your annual review. How do I define myself academically? Am I a clinical trialist, a lab-based researcher, clinical educator, education scholar, or a practicing physician? The next question is, how do I spend my time? Do I spend my time writing grants, or do I spend my time seeing patients? And just be mindful of where your time is going and what you're doing, what you're doing with your time. The next issue is, where does my salary come from? Am I supported by external funding, clinical revenue, education, or administration? And one other question is, what is the department's financial obligation to us as junior faculty members? Also, what is the percentage of my effort will be covered by the department? And that's something that we, especially basic sciences are actually debating at this moment. Well, yes. Also, as non-clinical faculty, other questions that we are asking, what are the options available for teaching as a basic scientist faculty? How do we get to teach within the medical school, and also how do we get graduate school appointment? So most of the basic scientists we have, well, outside of neurology, we have to get appointment in a different department. Most of us are appointed in pathology, where we could actually get graduates, students, and develop our teaching in that way. Also, how can basic scientists be better integrated into the clinical mission of the department? And as Danny mentioned a little earlier, in terms of like clinical research grants and collaborating with the clinicians, and also clinicians, we basic scientists, you could approach us to also collaborate, because we are very interested in collaborations with clinicians and clinicians in that way too. And also the other big question that we have is, what is the department's vision on recruiting and hiring more basic scientists? Most of the basic scientists we have in our department were promoted internally. And so we're, looking around, we're looking like, where is the department going in terms of bringing in more colleagues to support basic scientists, so that we could have more of a research educational opportunity, collaboration with others, basic scientists also. So these are certain questions that we're thinking of, and we think that should be questioned during our annual review. So, so we spoke about the dossier earlier. What's in your dossier? And this is very comprehensive, because I got it from the School of Medicine website. Your CV in a Duke format, synopsis of intellectual interest, intellectual development statement, and I think Pam's gonna help you. I saw she even gives you an outline of how to write your intellectual development statement, your list of graduate mentoring activities, your course syllabi if you teach one, your top 10 publications, your list of collaborators. You need external letters, at least 3, I think, for the first part, emails, soliciting evaluations, and the list goes on. And it continues over here, the search committee report from the time of hiring, copy of reappointment letters, chair assessment and recommendation. And some of these, I don't know if it applies to our committee, but copies of grant proposal and non-traditional scholarship, published book reviews, and anything, as Danny says, anything that you've ever done after you're hired, just keep a note of it. And then I put here, when nominated, Pamela Neville, she'll let you know of all the required documents. So I was told she's really good, and she'll definitely email you a list of things that you're gonna need to put in this dossier. So suggestions and recommendations, keep your APT CV up to date, keep updating everything, save everything, papers in the final typeset format from the journal, teaching evaluations, patients' comments, grant proposal. And if you're on the tenure track, develop a list of external evaluators to tap. So you're gonna need at least 8 to 10, I think, external people who are external to Duke, who's gonna write you a letter, recommendation letter. So from my time on the committee, what do I think? From what I get, they want to promote you. When the candidates are, every candidate I've seen being introduced to the committee, they were introduced favorably. They were introduced by either a division chief or somebody who somehow knows that person, and they, were very enthusiastic about those that person. If during the voting and the discussions, if consensus can't be reached, the issue is tabled and brought up in the next meeting. And usually that's during that, especially Danny and the others, they reach out to that person and tell them, like, this is where you're lacking, this is what's needed for the next meeting, and so that's what I've observed, that they seem to promoting you. The other thing I noticed is the committee seems conscientious of precedents, both here at Duke and nationwide. So sometimes they look outside of Duke. What is this other universities doing? What's going on even in other departments at Duke? And so, well, most of them seem to be very conscientious of precedents of what's going on. Voting is anonymous, so you don't know what well, I'm a non-voting member, so I don't vote, but the other member doesn't know what the other member, how the other member votes. So they send their vote anonymously. Also, what I think it would be nice to see more diversity on the committee in terms of these divisions represented. I went through, maybe because I'm in the headache division and I don't see anybody on there from the headache division. It's especially sex, it's like 3 females and 10 males on this division, and et cetera, et cetera. Also, would like to see more transparency to those not on the committee. There's still a lot of, yes, we are trying to make things more transparent, but there is still a lot of questions like, okay, like for instance, I know the committee doesn't have anything to do with setting salaries, but even that, like how one person get one salary versus another, just different areas of transparency that we would like to see, and like, so that's my time. Any questions of my time there?
Just to be clear, we have nothing to do with salary.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, somebody was, I think it's been brought up like a number of times, like who said, like if you're at the same rank, how are different people getting paid differently? Okay. So that okay.
But I think it's such an important point that you raised, also to start to keep track of updated CV as soon as you start thinking about where you're going. And there's a new form on the website that Pam put up that is quite interactive, and it helps you with your annual review also keep updated in that format.
Okay. Thank you.
No, that's
All right. So, hi, everybody. I'm Jordan Mayberry. I think I know pretty much everybody here, but for those that don't know me, I'm in the neuromuscular division, and Rich had asked me to speak on this teaching portfolio because I have a special interest in education. But I just wanted to make one comment. Does it kind of feel like the APT committee? They almost do like the Joaquin Phoenix in Gladiator, like the thumbs up or down for you there. So maybe with this teaching, it will help get like a thumbs up from that committee there. So objectives here. So just a little bit of background, some tabular teaching summary, and then what tabular feedback summary is. So kind of what like Danny was talking about, you're not really wanting to get 6 years along and trying to figure out what kind of lectures that you've given over those 6 years and being able to compile those as well as any other educational things that you've done. So hopefully this will help you organize that. So why? Most professionals know about the importance of your CV, but in an academic teaching institution, the typical format is not really sufficient for your time as an educator or teacher. So this was taken directly out of the faculty handbook there. And so I had highlighted, so I can read it out. Promotion along the faculty career track and untimed track that recognizes expectational contributions to Duke that impact the delivery of clinical care, advance the education of learners, and contribute to the original discovery and enhance the academic mission of Duke. So I highlighted the advancing the education of learners because that's what this one's about. So this was one that I was actually just informed about earlier. So we're probably going to go through something real quick that's not completely true here, but the domains of effort, clinical practice, education program, and original investigation serve as the primary areas of promotion evaluation on the faculty career track. Now, the one here is actually 2, I was told. So it impacting 2 of these domains is required for promotion. But this does allow education to be one of your primary focus of the evaluation and promotion. And I think what Danny was talking about, having that primary and then secondary area on his slides. So educational effort and effectiveness are expected of all faculty, and it's a central component of this promotion. Just kind of skip along here. So go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yes, and so actually in the faculty handbook, that was one of the bullet points that it brings up is needing to be engaged in the Duke Ahead program and having like a certificate there from an educational track. I might defer that one to Suma. I am in the process of that, but I have not had a certificate yet.
Yeah, they sign up for this and basically give you access to all our organizations. They have a couple different things that they offer to early educators, for all educators, with an angle toward the clinical. The first step of being kind of getting your information and saying why. Basically, you have talks that are littered throughout the academic year. The most recent one was the virtual tactics to help enhance learning. So there's always something that's pretty contemporary. The certificate granting programs are usually year long, where there are specific kind of subject setups where you learn, where you kind of look at what academic scholarship looks like, or educational scholarship looks like, and that's indicators. And then there's a culmination of about a year. Most recent program is 2 years that they've done, but every year they kind of set out a new set cohort. And you sit through dedicated sessions, you agree to clear out 2 days a month or so, and then at the end of the week, successfully completed this, and now you have that extra kind of batch of education. Yeah, and it takes, you can probably comment on what your current experience is, but it takes that carving up.
Yeah, time. And then I didn't actually know that it was a requirement, just that it was more of a suggestion until more reading through like the handbook. So I think it. Yeah. So moving on, so the main point of this PowerPoint is the tabular summary of teaching, mentoring, and educational activities, right? So whenever I'm at the very end there, it's going to actually show kind of all of this combined, but we're going to go through it kind of sync one by one. So as far as activities, so clinical teaching, a lot of us do this. This includes ward rounds, routine supervision of learners and clinical settings, preceptor activities. And so you really also want to include your estimated number and type of learners here, as well as hours worked with learners. So, if you're in the outpatient neurology clinic, you can list what you're doing there, how often you're there, who is with you. So if it's the neurology residents, you have a APP resident that's coming through and working, and then how many hours per week, compared to maybe somebody that's more inpatient heavy. You can put on there, you're a consult attending, you're doing that so many weeks a year, and then who's been on the service with you as far, especially like when you're educating, learning them. As far as like lectures go, so this is kind of what Danny was getting at earlier. You want to stay on top of this. So you really want to know the number and audience as far as like the course name, if applicable as well. So it's easiest if you're able to like break this down into your undergrad medical education. So like Duke Medical Student Lecture, let's say that you did one over altered mental status. There's on average about 130 medical students, although I don't know if anybody's given one of these lately. It's room a lot more bare than this. Usually it's through Zoom, but most of them are getting on during that time or later. And then as far as graduate medical education, so if you're teaching to our residents here, that would be another little area that you can put under there, and how many you have. US, yeah, I can. So moving along, so some others. So as far as seminars and case conferences, you can have formal seminars, case conferences that you presented at or indirectly did. So like we attend morning report. And so that would be something that you could list here, how often you're doing it. And again, I'm trying to see what kind of group of people that you're actually interacting with there. I made something else up over here on examples. So, if you're running some multiple sclerosis research conference weekly, you're doing about 40 sessions a year. That would also be something that you should put in this place, and also stating how many people are in that. So laboratories wise, so this can really be from documented supervisors in any type of laboratory, such as surgical, practical labs, pathology labs, physiology labs. I help teach some in the anatomy lab as far as on cadavers and doing lumbar punctures. And again, always really having who you're teaching as well as about how many people are there with you. Mentoring activities. So this is just really anybody that you are coming in contact with and being a mentor for. That this can be formal or informal. So as far as like a mentorship, that might be more formal. You have Jane Smith, MD, they're a neurology resident, you're a faculty advisor for them. So that'd be maybe something a little bit more formal compared to John Smith, that's a fourth year medical student that just wanted to come by, shadow you in your clinic for the day or research lab and see what that is about. And you can also place that there. As far as research preceptorships, though that includes like medical students, really pretty much anybody here, fellows, graduate students, postdocs, junior faculty as well. So this would be somebody like Jane Smith coming in, they're a vascular fellow, and you've mentored them through something comparing aspirin to Eliquis and ischemic stroke. CME, so there's actually two portions here. This one is actually within Duke itself. And so that would include things such as grand rounds, journal clubs, or any other type of CME activities at Duke in which you're participating in. And so if you were to give a grand rounds, for instance, at an endocrine grand rounds and listing your talk there, again, the date and how many people estimate of how many people there. Also, any type of journal club that you're hosting. So you're hosting it for like the neuro ICU and your fellows or the residents journal club. Those are things that you could put in here. As far as like course and curriculum development, so that's really any major role in designing a revision of an educational activity such as medical school courses, resident seminars, or CME programs. And so the brain and behavior course, a lot of us I think probably are familiar with, especially with like Lynn White's there. So if you're assisting in that in any way, that would be maybe a course that you're helping to like develop with him. Other materials developed. So this is kind of a catch-all for from that previous slide as far as like course curriculum development. So this is a little bit more broad. That can be due to things such as videos or audio teaching tapes, CDs that are done. I think not trying to call anybody out, but I think Dr. Morganlander actually did a CD about neurologic teaching, and that was handed out through the medical school some years back. I've done a biostatistic course with Joe Brogan that's doing medical grand rounds here over a stroke case, and that was really more like statistical analysis of that and kind of like an E module. So those types of things would be able to go into this category. Educational committees. So Suma Das has actually formed the Duke Neurology Education Academy. So that would be something that could actually go underneath this as an example. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so, and that's a good point. So we will get to that here in just a little bit. So hold that thought. So I mentioned about presentations like outside of Duke. Again, that would be something along the lines of grand rounds. If you are invited to give some type of grand round somewhere, then that would be going here. And you can have an other. I think this presentation is an other. So this was also in the handbook, so I thought that was very interesting as far as your impact outside of the institution. It's not required here, but that is something as far as documented regional, national, or international impact will strengthen your promotion. So again, hopefully maybe giving that thumbs up for you. Go ahead.
Associate professor that regional, but they did document that.
Yeah, this is first step, not last step. Mm-hmm. Well, I've been told that you can. I mean, it's not necessarily the most easy way to do it, but yes, I think your answer.
I think the important point is that you put out a lot of durable materials, right? You did electronic, digital, CDs. So it doesn't have to be necessarily publication, as long as it's durable, extra institutional impact. And for professors, they're not going to require 6 national letters saying, yes, this guy. And a great example of White, I think, primarily wasn't based on publication, based on international teaching reputation. Exactly. It does have publication. Well, 3-1 has professor, but it was really on the basis of his education, and it was scholarly. It wasn't just that he was a great educator and he taught well. It was like he developed curricula, actually tested his curriculum, his scholarship, and
yeah,
internationally recognized.
So why does it go to school Okay, so it's a formality.
But they do have, but they did make clear, like in the institutional meeting last week, full professor, clinical track, meeting that sort. You used to just have three external letters, well, we want three national letters that have the document. Even if everybody knows you.
So
Yeah.
for a full professor.
For full professor, but it is representative, it would be good if we were fighting.
Yeah, and in at AAN last year, like in some of the educational seminars, there was somebody that was pretty prominent in the field and was discussing the fact that he had not had really any papers ever published, but through his institution was still able to become a full professor and things. There were a lot of ways to do that, but internationally being known is the biggest. So like I said, this was. Yes. Yep. So this was just kind of a slide there, a screenshot of putting all of that together in more of this tabular summary. And what Rich was talking about earlier, I put in here as well. So your CV can really be referenced at any point during this as appropriate to say, you know, you can go over there to see what else that I'm doing. I just am echoing what Danny was talking about as far as constantly updating your tabular teaching summary. There's no need to procrastinate. If you do, you will forget about it. You will not remember certain details, things of that sort. So if you're able to keep on top of this, sometimes whenever I get invited to do a talk, I'll go ahead, go over to my summary, put it in there. If it doesn't happen for whatever reason, yeah. Yeah, and then we're going to be coming up on some feedback here as well, but it just helps you to stay on top of that because a lot of us are getting pulled in different directions and to be able to keep that in an organized fashion. So impact, again, I think that was already said during Danny's talk, but again, I wanted to highlight the education of learners there. And so impact, how are you going to be able to know that? So we need to measure impact, and teaching feedback summary is really a crucial way to be able to do this. And so mentioned about patient comments. This would be more of comments from the medical students, for instance. So School of Medicine teaching comments. You know, Dr. Osler was a wonderful, knowledgeable, engaged group Osler teacher and really invested in teaching, right? And so if you've ever given a talk here at Duke, for instance, these comments are available to yourself. And so that is. Yeah, and I think that's what this like impact statement is talking about, right? How can we know that you're a good teacher? I think you asked, well, if I'm getting invited back each time to give the same talk, perhaps that's it, but there's some ways to be able to maybe quantify this. Yeah. So speaking of metrics, so kind of skipping over the GME teaching comments here, a metric. So you also can get this at, for instance, here at Duke, they'll do these mean Likert scores as far as for whoever is giving the presentation. And so that's just basically like this 5-point scale. They have all of these questions that they are giving to the medical students. And that's also getting you compared to some of the other people that are also giving lectures. So this would be more of like a quantitative way of seeing how you're comparing to your peers. So just a little bit of a summary statement here as far as keeping up with your teaching summary, tabular feedback, and any other like documents really to be able to show your accomplishments and impact as an educator. Yeah. I am starting to. I blush whenever you ask for a junior faculty member to give us this talk as far as for tenure track and things since I haven't got there yet, but I am starting. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
You get paid for that. So for every hour you do, there's money that gets transferred to your name to the department, and that could actually help protect time. So for example, if you gave a one-off lecture, you get paid for the 1 hour lecture, 6 hours preparation time. You might get 7 hours for it. Maybe it doesn't make a difference in overall salary if you want to do. But when you're actually doing a course or developing a course, you get substantial transfer of funds from the Office of Curriculum School that's in your name to the department that should be transparent. That don't carve out part of your protected time.
Okay.
I'm not sure everyone knows that, but
Yes, that is I know some of where it's coming from, like as far as like the educational salary and things, but I did not know that, so that is good.
Hi, my name's Simon Gregory. I'm the Vice Chair of Research within the department. And so what I'm going to talk about is promotion and tenure for, basic scientists within the department. But what I've tried to do is include other, tips and tricks that I've learned over my time here at Duke. I've been here for almost 20 years now. And when I actually started, I knew nothing and no one really told me anything. So sort of dropped me in it and let me sink or swim. And thankfully, I didn't sink too far. There's tremendous amount of resources that are available to you at Duke. I put the website up here. It's sort of faculty development. So I'm going to go through some of the stuff that everyone said about making sure your CV is up to date, etc. But there are resources that you can, plug into. Duke has been much better over the last probably 5 and 10 years at centralizing these resources, as well as identifying things that you should be sort of improving in yourself. From that first page, there's a number of links out. They talk about the programs with respect to leadership. And there are leadership opportunities at Duke. As everyone said, that if you are doing sort of extracurricular or extra activities on top of what you're paid to do, you should make sure you denote those in your CV. But there are plenty of opportunities for leadership or development of leadership skills within your career. Importantly, there's underrepresented faculty development as well. One thing that was very noticeable when I first came to Duke in 2003 is that we were trying to recruit diverse student body, both at the sort of graduate student level, but also at the med student level. But one of the challenges that students see is if they don't recognize their mentors from the same same diversity group, they're less likely to come to Duke. And so Duke has worked really hard to not only attract faculty, but also retain them. So this is very important for programs for underrepresented faculty. There's also opportunity for faculty coaching. So Jody, do you want to just pipe up about that?
But there is something I can tell you if people are interested. I could put together like a session or sessions around promotion. Typically, it would be something around getting more documentation ready and kind of just getting over some of these hurdles. That could be something to do with study. And maybe Simon and I could get together and kind of put that together. So I'd be willing to do that if there's interest in person or even on Zoom. I know just for myself, just having the momentum is really hard, but I feel like if I had a group of people that were together and break out the diet
Sure. Yep. And Anne Brown, who's the Vice Dean of Faculty in the School of Medicine, says only glowing things about Jodi's coaching prowess. So I think you should really take advantage of it. And we can develop that within the department. Something that I never really thought about until probably 10 years in at Duke is there's other resources. And one of the things you should think about is everyone thinks what they write makes sense and what they write communicates to people. There's actually George Gopin was a professor at Duke and an English professor. And when I first heard about this course, I thought, you know, what's an English professor going to tell me about science? But it's not about science itself, it's about the art of communication. And so the Gopin lectures were in person. COVID has pushed them into an online lecture series. They are incredibly valuable. Just to think about sentence structure, paragraph structure. And these are not only applicable for writing papers, but also grants. So the art of communication is absolutely critical in all stages of your career when you communicate. Yeah, yep. So you go to the resources and then I think it's grant writing / research. And then it sort of pops out into George's online videos. It's really useful. I hated it. Oh yeah, yeah. I hated English at school. I barely passed and I never thought I'd need it. But when I went back to my high school took me back and asked me to give a lecture about Gattaca. And the first thing I told them was I hated English. And you see the English teachers go, oh my God, who have we invited back? But it's critically important to be able to communicate. Okay, so you saw this before from Danny. This is sort of the assistant professor and tenure clock. And then you're making the decision for the basic scientists, whether to go into the faculty tenure track or the career track. And you've got sort of 5 years to make up your mind. Quite honestly, not the tenure track is not for everyone. The career track may be for, you know, others where you're still expected to contribute to the department, get grants, get funding, write papers, but your tenure track trajectory is not necessarily as highly impacted or as stressful as being on the career track. And so not everyone is adept at assembling the body of work that's going to facilitate the promotion through the tenure track. And I think one of the most difficult things is to make that realization that, you know, are you going to be competitive or are you not? But you've got a good number of years to think about it. Then importantly, as Danny said, you have this really important career discussion with your division chief, with the department chair. You know, you can talk to me anytime as vice chair of research about this, anytime during those 5 years, not at the point at which you think, oh crap, I have to make the decision, but what's going to entail in each of the processes, and whether you think that you're ready for it, because it is a competitive process. If you decide that the career track is best for you, as Danny said, you can continue as an assistant professor, associate professor, and then full professor over a period of time. If you want to pursue the tenure track, again, it's another 5 years before you get to the really important part, which is review of the tenure application. So this is something that the APT committee and myself worked, which I'm on the APT committee, worked really hard on for a basic science document that the basic scientists within the department could understand what are the steps and what's entailed to get to the point at which you have a tenure application. Basic scientists within clinical departments quite frequently get the sort of raw end of the stick. I think I'm mixing my metaphors, but are not seen as peers with our basic scientists in basic science departments. And so what the APT committee want to do is really make sure that the level of scientists that's getting to this point is equivalent to our basic science department colleagues. And so we maintain a very high bar to get to this point. Having said that, we don't benefit from the same, 20, 30% coverage by the basic science department simply because Rich doesn't get the flow throughs from grants that we obtain. And so it's an uneven playing field. But this is, I think, is a really important starting point for tenure within the department for basic scientists, which until, I received tenure a couple of years ago as the first basic scientist to get tenure within the department for 30 years. And that's really through Rich's drive to make sure that basic scientists are recognized as tenure eligible and tenure worthy within neurology, which has been fantastic. And then we also, you have a series of criteria moving from associate to professor to full professor with tenure. I was talking to Danny about this within the document, and the document's freely available, what's required at each step. And I've added text in there that, Carlene was saying that quite often it's difficult to know what's required at these steps. And Pam has been fantastic. So I'll echo that with setting you up for, establishing what the criteria are in the various documents. But one of the things I noticed was that we don't have a decision if you're rejected for tenure. So we have a series of criteria we want you to satisfy. The APT committee votes on it. And normally in a basic science department, if you go for tenure and you don't get it, you're expected to leave. And that it's sort of within 12 months, I think, or something like that. So the intent is you don't get tenure, you don't have a position here at Duke. It rarely happens. I've known a few people over the years, but we feel like if you've got to that point and you're a basic scientist within neurology, you're still generating really, really important work and you're a valued colleague. And so we're thinking about discussing, if you don't get tenure as an associate professor, you move over to the career track. And so we don't lose you as a valued member. You may make the decision was, screw it, if they're not going to give me tenure, I'm going to go somewhere else who will. But still, it gives you the opportunity that you don't have 12 months that you have to be out. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. Again, it's in the document that we developed, just the different levels of expectations around publications for tenure track, which is on the left, and career tracks on the right. So it's sort of expected or supportive. Funding from, government, federal funding, various levels of impact of funding. Service is critical. Quite often it can be challenging to find the committees and things that you can volunteer for, but we've listed a few here. If you do have grants, make your SRO, your scientific research officer, I think they're called within study sections. They're your point of contact, not necessarily the program officer that you will contact, but contact the PO and the SRO, let them know that if you have an R01, you want to serve on a committee. You want to serve on study section, you want to review grants and things like that. So that sort of gets your foot in the door and helps you pay back, if you like. So I've sat on the K Award study section for the NINDS for probably about 8 or 9 years now. Mentoring. So we added this because it is critical that if we're going to be seen on the same playing field as our basic scientist colleagues, that we are seen as mentors of the next generation of scientists. And so this is something that's we've added. It is going to be a challenge to get a nomination to the graduate school. We already have a few of our basic science colleagues who have had nominations to the graduate school. So that means that if you are a member of a program, you're nominated, you give a seminar, they vote on you, it then goes to the graduate school. They decide whether you're good enough to be graduate faculty, and then you can have students. There are some challenges around getting nominations, but mentoring not just of undergrads, not just of postdocs, but graduate students is really important to move forward. And then we have various non-NIH research funding. Now, one thing that I brought to the APT committee, and I want to emphasize this, is not being used for promotion and is also not comparing basic scientists to clinical faculty, is a scorecard. And, I'm more than happy to share the scorecard with you. But what it does is gives you a realization about the types of things you should be thinking about as a competitive candidate for promotion. So what are the types of grants? So you can live you can't live your life off R21s. You should be thinking about, you can have a K award, a small R award, R21, R01, be part of a PO1, a UO1, and things like that, and how they actually contribute to you as a sort of development of your legacy with respect to research. Also, publications. It does matter where you are in the publication order. Obviously, if you're junior, you're looking at first or the first couple of places. As you become more senior, you should be at the end. And obviously, if you're doing well within your lab, you should be producing multiple senior author papers. So impact factor is very important. In this age where we have preprints, med archives and bioarchives are appearing in people's CVs, they're appearing in bio sketches, etc. Again, they're not peer reviewed, so anyone can stick a preprint on those two sites. But we still use impact factor as a metric. Danny mentioned H-index. So there's multiple indices that you need to think about where your science is getting published. Teaching's important. As we have heard before, mentoring I've already emphasized. So it's not just undergraduate, but postgraduate. You can have rotation students if you're a part of a graduate program, summer students, MSTP students, etc. And then the funding, which I cited. Administrative work, it's the busy work that we get a whole 2% to cover ourselves, but it's still very important that you're contributing towards various aspects. You don't have to be part of a graduate program to be on someone's thesis committee, okay? So if you have the opportunity, if you're working with a mentee in someone else's lab and their work aligns with what you're doing, but you're not part of that program, you can be on their thesis committee. So that's an external expert that doesn't have to be within that program. Visibility we've heard about before, national and international visibility. Go to the opening of an envelope. Make sure you're there to give a talk, give a poster, just get your science out there and make sure you record it. So what I've learned over 19 years that no one's going to push you forward. Your career development is really up to you. So no one can make you progress in your career unless you have a desire to make it happen. And it doesn't just happen. You need to be talking with your division chief and your department chair. Make yourself aware of the resources that Duke shows, and not only the web page that I showed you before, but also what Pam's developing is also really important. If you find a resource that you hadn't read about, or you feel like there's a gap in what you want to learn, make sure you ask about it. Don't just wait for the annual meeting with your division chair or your department chair, division chief or department chair. Ask your colleagues, ask Danny, ask myself, ask Rich, how did we get to where we are? What did we do at a certain stage of our career? And even ask your peers, what are you doing? How's your CV? What meetings are you going to? When are you presenting and things like that? So that's really important. As I said, don't just let things happen. You have to be proactive. You have to make things happen if you want to be promoted. Like Danny said, don't spread yourself too thin. It's okay to say no. It's okay to be a little bit selfish, but conversely, you have to be sort of the good citizen at Duke and be part of committees and things like that. Everyone said, keep your CV up to date. And for God's sake, make sure it's properly formatted. The worst thing in the world is looking at someone's CV. It's not left aligned. The fonts are different size. The references are all different format. Make sure your name is in bold. So just make sure it's consistent. The best way is if you see someone's CV, if they're coming around for interviews and you think, wow, I really like the look of that CV, just copy it. Oh, well, not copy the contents, copy the format, because it's really important that it not only contains really important aspects of what you've done, but it's in a good format that's readable. Develop an objective advisor so they don't have to be in your science, but you respect their perspective. Of giving you, pretty much how it is. And as Rich and Danny know, I am very good at giving you how it is. So I'll let you know if you just want to ask perspective, but my door is always open as a vice chair of research within the department. Okay. Simon. Yep.
There's been a couple of sort of direct and indirect references. I just kind of want to know a bit more. It may or something that other kind of different flow in that.
Right. So I don't see me as being any different to anyone who's in a basic science department. So someone at a assistant professor level or an associate professor, if you're doing a similar sort of science to me, they're my colleagues. I'm not looking up to them. I'm not looking down to them. They are my colleagues with respect to stage in the career and the type of science that you're carrying out, the type of grants you're submitting, the quality of the research that you're carrying out. So that's who I see as my peers or my colleagues.
Yeah, I guess a lot of us colleagues.
Right.
Me, most
Yep.
there might be sort of mental difference.
Yeah. Yep. And I think it's fine to identify who you feel your colleagues are. And it's a lot of it's driven by the science, if they're, I don't know, if it's developing a device or it's somehow associated with, pathology or, neuropsych or anything like that. It's up to you to define who you feel your peers are, and who your colleagues are. And it's going to vary pretty much everyone who's carrying out research within the room, will probably overlap. Well, this could be one part of the Venn diagram, but there's lots of, different parts of the science and departments that we touch externally. Yep.
Thank you all for all the comments. So the reason why we're an academic, we want to contribute, right? I appreciate what Dan is saying with that quote, make us hopeful. But still, what is at stake? Like, it's like, like careers that somebody tells me maybe like
Oh, what it means.
Be versus what it is now. What is achieved by actually achieving that?
So I'll start because I have some gray hair, what's left. So when I first came to Duke, I thought, tenure was 100% salary for life type thing, and you've got it made. But over the time that I've been here, well, not just at Duke, but nationally and internationally, the idea of tenure is very different, and people are trying to do away with it just because of what I said. They've got legacy tenure faculty who cost the institution funds just to pay them a certain amount of money. Now, within the clinical departments, and it's going to depend on the meetings that are upcoming, it could mean that tenure is 60% of your salary is going to be covered if you have a lapse in grant funding, but that 60% is going to decrease by 10% every year. So it's not going to be, champagne and roses for the rest of your life. They can't afford it simply. And so there's this sort of reduction of salary coverage to sort of encourage you either to get grants, buy the store brand food instead of the top shelf stuff, or you move. It's simple as that. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I got tenure. It was a chair at the time of the division of this. I got a letter in it. Congratulations, one of the people who got tenure. That's fantastic. Just to be clear, does not affect any said, yes, does it mean anything? I think it has huge symbolic representation. Well, you know, I give my life to the institution and like that, like they're what they think. On the other hand, I'm not sure it has a lot of practical significance. I think
No.
it reads a lot if you're an iconic English professor with very controversial ideas. Don't you don't think fire? I don't know that it makes a lot of sense in what we do, but you're absolutely right. It doesn't guarantee you can base salary that 10K on an annual basis. Traditionally, it was 10% per year, but a few years ago, as this conversion was going through, it changed it every 6 months. Okay, every year. You know, so it does guarantee you salary, but mostly I think it's an abstract. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Institution has commitment back to you commensurate with your.
It was a big thing when the School of Medicine took off assistant research professor or associate research professor, because for some reason having research in the title meant that you were less autonomous. And so that was a big thing when they did that probably 10 plus years ago. But as Danny said, tenure, and did I say I was tenured on my bio online? Absolutely, I did. But it's more of a becoming more of a symbolic thing rather than a backstop. And like I said, yeah, absolutely.
And as a follow-up, very good. I do.
So that's the important question. You're on a 1-year contract, but it's a shared discretion. You're going to set up in a multi-year contract. Because that's really, I think, where the rubber is to work. What's my job description? I did 5 years.
Right. And then, you know, biostatistics and bioinformatics, I can't remember whether they did get away from tenure, but they were trying to offer 5-year contracts to their faculty as well, just so they're not going to be on the hook. Yep. All right. Cool.
Okay. Okay. I think we're running a little bit ahead on schedule, and I'll try to keep up that trend the best I can. I was asked to talk about clinical research opportunities, and I really wasn't sure where to start with this. I did try to put a lot of thought into it and get some feedback from Danny and some other people. But what I'm going to try to do here is kind of review the different types of clinical research. I know that some of us in the room have a basic science background. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. So I'm a medical director for our neuroscience clinical research organization, and also do a bit of clinical research myself. And I tried to approach this from. Thank you. I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but that's neuromuscular ultrasounds, my biggest interest, I would say. But I tried to gauge this for people who are not coming from that basic science background, people maybe more like me that thought we were headed to straight clinical practice, but ended up at an academic institution and found out they really liked clinical research. So this is kind of a how-to on how to get involved, how to get those mentors and networks established, not just at Duke, but on a national and even international scale, and some things that you have to know to start the research process here at Duke. So this is my overview of how to generally think about the clinical research that we do. I think there's 2 main categories to look at: what's initiated by a principal investigator and what's externally created. So with the PI initiated, that doesn't mean that it's unfunded necessarily. It means it's your thoughts, your ideas. Now, You may have your own funding source. Maybe you're independently wealthy. That would be great. Most of us probably not. But when I say departmental funding, sometimes there are small funds to support projects to get going, but oftentimes this is your protected time that you get, that 1 or 2 half days a week where you can conduct these projects. You can also look at foundational funding. There's a lot of neurology foundations. Just in neuromuscular, we have the GBS CIDP Foundation that's been a source of funding, the American Neuromuscular Foundation, which have funded 2 of our junior faculty within the last couple of years for projects that they developed on their own, their ideas. And of course, everyone's goal is federal funding, getting something from the NIH. But that's a tough go out of the gate if you're just getting started in clinical research. And yeah, we'll cover that a little bit, but then you get the externally created projects. Those might be in the clinical realm, industry-sponsored multi-center clinical trials, which are actually a good opportunity to understand how the research world works and to offer new therapies for our patients. And then you can get some multi-center federal and foundation funded trials like StrokeNet. There's a muscle study group. There's a lot of different organizations that come together and get federal funding for those purposes. So again, talking about the PI initiated projects, it's your idea and your methods. And I think this is really how you decide where you want to go and define yourself in clinical research realm. Oftentimes, if you're at the medical instructor or fellow level, really what you need to do is start out with these minimal resource, minimal risk projects. And this might be quality improvement. For example, say that in your observation, you think that epilepsy patients that are on drug X tend to have more migraine headaches. Well, do a retrospective chart review to determine if that's the case. And maybe Dr. Shah can tell us a little bit about that, because I think she's up next for SlicerDicer. But yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of resources here at Duke that we can use to do that. But if you have your own patient database, like we do with the myasthenia gravis database, or with our Muscular Dystrophy Association patients, you can use that. Case series might help you kind of congeal and formulate your ideas and hypothesis about what's going on with a group of patients, a condition, or their treatments, and also educational projects. I personally don't do a lot of educational projects. I don't think it's one of my strengths, but Dr. Mayberry may find out that doing a flipped classroom, for example, is the best way to teach the medical students, or another method that he develops to improve the quality of education. For a case report, the first thing is that you take the time to realize you've seen something unusual or unique. And the further along you get in practice, I guess the more you see and the more you kind of overlook is just, that's something we see. But as a fellow medical instructor, junior faculty of any sort, pay attention and grab those unique cases. You do a literature search, see if anyone else has described it or if it's been incompletely described. We just had a recent case where a patient with porphyria presented with a rapidly progressive sensory neuropathy. And that's supposed to be a motor process that happens. So these things come up, and it's a good way to get your name out there and maybe develop an additional idea. And in fact, all those things in the left-hand column often generate projects in the right-hand column. They serve oftentimes as pilot data, your foundation, your springboard to do a prospective trial. For example, going back to our quality improvement kind of case, okay, maybe those people on drug X wouldn't get migraine headaches if they took it in the morning instead of the evening. And you do a prospective trial where you're going to say, compare the two groups, that's still minimal resource and kind of, a small study, but something that is prospective. Observational, interventional studies also flow from those things on the left. And then you start thinking about funding applications. Duke has a lot of institutional resources that you can use for that. For example, I applied for 2 institutional funding sources. One was called the Enable Grant with the PDC that allowed me to spend more time with biomed engineering on their ultrasound projects with shear wave imaging. And then from that, we applied jointly with the lab I was working with Kathy Nightingale for the MedX funding, which was 1 year of funding, $50,000. We got pilot data and used that to apply to the NIH and got an R01 awarded for that. So that's how you use those institutional grants to go forward. We were going to look at a foundation funding in between if the NIH application hadn't gone through, but you can see how these things can flow from institutional funding to something bigger. And four. And yeah, so initially I had 1 case report and 3 review articles. That's what I came out of residency with. There was no original clinical research there, but it was enough of a taste of things that I decided this is really what I want to try to do. And as far as collaborations with other departments or divisions, I can tell you how I got in touch with biomedical engineering. I Googled and I got someone's name, said, Dr. Nightingale. Yeah. Yeah, who was interested in what I was interested in. And I thought, well, this could apply to nerve and muscle. I sent her an email through the Duke system and she said, come on over. And about 2 weeks after that, there were 14 different people over there meeting with me. And so it's more of a translational environment. And I would say anyone I've contacted at Duke within neurology, outside clinical medicine, anyone has been happy to at least sit and talk with me and kind of tease through some ideas. So I would encourage everybody to do that. I've not had any experience with anyone saying, no, that's a bad idea. I don't want to talk about it. Everyone's very open to new ideas. So back to Dr. O'Brien's point, is federally funded research the only way? No. And I think we have to look, especially in clinical research, at the environment we're in. It's a little bit difficult to quantify how much clinical research is federally funded, but it was estimated to be less than about 20% at this point. So it's going to be hard to sustain a clinical research career on federal funding. And while that is, often considered our goal and the marker of highest success, a lot of very well-known, very successful clinical researchers never get an NIH grant. So it's a lot different, I think, than the basic science research environment. So if you can't get to that goal, there are other options. And I think the most important thing is to start your research, establish what you're interested in right away, no matter how small that effort seems to be. So kind of walking through my approach to this, and I think I've met with a couple of people who are in the audience tonight and told them this firsthand. And please always feel free to call me or email me if you want to talk further about it. But my rule is questions lead to questions. Don't underestimate yourself. If you have a question in the clinic about why something's working or doesn't working, why do these two things go together so many times? Other people have that question too. Trust your instinct on that. Don't undersell yourself. And if you're like me with no background really in research, what I did was start with chart reviews, quality improvement projects that are really practical. They don't require high level statistical knowledge and knowing how to do all the right methods right away. Again, minimal risk, and they really allow you. Yeah. Yeah, and if you've ever, wandered into the EMG lab, Dr. Sanders will often be there saying, I've got 25 database search projects we can work on if you want to. He's always looking for help. Always looking for help to do that. And, these questions that can arise from simple chart review studies often lead to prospective studies and funding. But there's some other things that are a bit. Yeah, and he really stresses the importance of using databases as much as possible. But other things you might not think of is volunteer to review manuscripts for journals. Find a journal in your subspecialty. Message the editor. They are always looking for reviewers. And that helps get your name out there, helps get you known. It also helps you understand where the literature is in your subspecialty. It helps you frame your own question and devise methods for what you want to do. It helps you understand statistical analysis better. This is a really valuable tool that I think is really underestimated and how it can forward your research career. You also want to talk to more senior members of your division and say, hey, I'm interested in research. Can I be sub-I on one of your projects? Is there anything I can do? Almost everyone is too busy and will have something for you to do. And they'll be willing to guide you through the process. I also encourage everyone, even though we're all really busy, now that conferences are back in person, go to conferences for your specialty. Go to the poster sessions, go to the scientific sessions and talk to people. Again, most all these people are willing to talk and willing to offer guidance. They're willing to answer questions and they will remember you. And for example, I had the opportunity to design an ultrasound course for a national meeting. And I'm always looking for new people. And I thought, I remember this person from California who came and asked me a lot of great questions after a lecture I did. That's who I invited to give a talk. And that's, how things work with networking. And then again, since then, I've invited her to be part of a multi-center study. So don't be shy, go to those conferences and talk to people. On an institutional level, we have our clinical research unit, the Neuroscience Clinical Research Organization. Let our staff know you're interested in studies and what types of things you do. Even for me, one of the things I've been looking for a study in is IBM, inclusion body myositis. The study went to the totally wrong department, then the totally wrong division, but because we had our word out in neuromuscular, it got back around to us. And we're trying to make that study get off the ground, offering a treatment for an untreatable disease. Another Duke research resource is My Research Home. You can see the website ID down at the bottom. You need to use this. I don't use it enough, admittedly. This is from my own page. It keeps track of projects you have going, any agreements you have with other institutions on data sharing. Is your training up to date for all you need to do to continue doing research and working here? But based on the interest and publication list that you put in, it will recommend funding opportunities to you. So this is, again, a good resource that's geared toward you. The more information about yourself you put in, the better those recommendations are going to be. Now, kind of take a few slides to talk about the nuts and bolts of what we have to do a research project within neurology. You have to let your clinical research unit, in this case, the NCRO, know so you can get approval at the department level before you send it to our institutional review board. This includes chart reviews and retrospective reviews of things. So be sure to do that. Before you do anything clinical, you also have to do some necessary training. You have to do the infamous city training modules and the responsible conduct of research training, which is a bit unique to Duke. No matter what your background is, no matter how much you know or don't know, everybody has to complete these modules. Now, if you come from another institution, city training is used by a lot of different places. Those credits you got at the other institution should carry forward with you. And when you log in using your Duke ID under Duke Health as your organization, that's going to populate. But the RCR training is something you have to do 2 courses in. You can do them online or in person here at Duke. Again, this is loaded up under the city website, so easy to get these in. Most of this can be done a couple hours during your admin time in the evening or even on the weekend if you need to do that, but it's not overly cumbersome requirements. Second part is your IRB submission. The NCRO internet has an IRB submission template that kind of guides you through what you need to include when you do a research summary to submit to the IRB. It will guide you through some sections on study design, recruitment, things you'll need to think about before you write your summary out and send it over to the IRB. Data protection, data management are also going to be part of that and really beyond the length of this discussion. And you'll be able to use a form to decide how much support you need from the CRU on guiding the IRB submission. There's a nice little form that you fill out. And if you're comfortable, if you're doing a chart review, you probably don't need really much support. You can write your summary, you can do your submission, they'll look over your shoulder and there really won't be any charge for that. However, if you're asking them to write the whole thing and do everything, there are going to be charges. And we have like kind of like an a la carte menu, so you can pick and choose what you want from that. And you sign a memorandum of understanding that tells you how much things cost. And for a chart review, you really shouldn't have to pay any money. Most of the interventional studies, you really shouldn't cost you anything. That's why it's called a minimal risk, minimal resource. But if you're doing something prospective where there's a risk to the patient, you're going to need a research coordinator. That's when the charges start to mount up. What you'll see here is if you ask the NCRO to do everything for startup, that's $4,500. That is a number I've never had to pay unless I've had external funding for an interventional study. What you need to know is that with the help of a faculty member who's been through this before, they can help you take care of almost everything. For most of my studies that have been PI initiated and single site, I essentially need maybe someone for data entry or REDCap database design, something like that. But these are just general guidelines. As you move up the ladder and start applying for external funding, please know that Duke charges 61% overhead for federal funding. And that's kind of a national average. It's not as high as some places. It's not as low as others. But if you get $100,000, you know, 61,000 of it goes to administering the grant. I'm often asked why the industry rate is lower. Why is it going to be 45% total? Well, because the industry sponsored studies take care of a lot of the oversight for Duke that Duke doesn't have to support. But it is kind of frustrating when you're budget planning to realize that a lot of what you bring in is not going to come to you, your patients, or your study project, but just putting that out there so it's not a surprise to anyone. As you do research, you'll hear a little bit about Encore. This is something NCRO takes care of for you. Essentially, it's a system that tracks any subject that's consented into your study and shows how many times they come in for a study visit. It's designed to protect the patient from being billed for research studies. And again, not something you really need to know a lot about, but just putting it out there so that you'll know that terminology. So finally closing out with a few quick reminders and tips on things. If you plan on publishing anything, even if it's a quality improvement project, you have to go through the IRB. Quality improvement and educational projects that aren't going to be published and don't do any intervention, they don't have to go through the IRB, but I think you want to get recognized for the work you do. And I would recommend trying to get that published somewhere. If you have an idea for a project, I would contact Lisa Gager or Jessica Carlson. But oftentimes, if you've got someone in your department, in your division, I would actually go to them first. And they can guide you through the majority of your questions because they've been there before. And if they don't know, they'll refer you to the NCRO for the final word on something. Yeah, no one, it's important to remember, no one here, I don't think, knows all the rules and all the regulations except those people who are in the position to manage the CRUs. It changes all the time. And no question you ask is going to be unusual, too simple. It's always better to ask up front and get that clarified so you're not in trouble later or banned from doing research at Duke or banned from federal funding, which can happen. Other things that I recommend, always offer to write a review article with a senior faculty member. Again, let them know you want to do research and find someone at Duke or even another institution who you really feel comfortable that they have your interest at heart and can give you guidance on your subspecialty. Does not have to be the same thing you're interested in, just someone who's been down the path that you're starting. And no, just someone that you connect with. And sometimes it takes a couple of tries to get the right person, but there are plenty of people here at Duke that are willing to help. And for those outside of Duke, you can meet them at a lot of these subspecialty national meetings. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So I started on one.
That would,
Just like, let's say, informal list. That's fine. Yeah, we're gonna do it. That sounds great. Yeah. Yeah, no, sure. People who are writing grants. 5 weeks. And then whoever's doing it. And I mean use. Yeah, with the muscle. Science. Yeah.
it's a great idea and pretty timely because today I got an email from another institution asking me to pre-review a grant within a week, an application for their institution, $300. And but as a 1 to 2 pages. But I thought, why are we not offering this service here? I mean, internally, like the neuromuscular division, we read over each other's grant applications, but sometimes things that are clear to you within your subspecialty and your little world are not clear to people on the outside. And I think it's always helpful to have someone external to the project to review it. Pay it. This was 1 to 2 pages. Yeah, it was all they asked for. Yeah. And to wrap things up, I just posted some other Duke resources, including some training programs that are available for clinical research. And again, this is going to be really redundant, especially the last point. Keep track of all your funding and presentations, publication as they happen. This is extremely important. I think everyone has said this, and I can't, reiterate it enough. But talk to people, let people know you're interested, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions by phone or email. And thanks. Yeah, I can do that.
All right, I'm about to be the outlier because I'm the last talk before Rich comes back, and I will not tell you to remember everything because that's not the topic that I'm talking on. I am here to introduce you all to SlicerDicer, which you've heard mentioned a few times here already today. And my experience with it has really kind of ramped up in the last year and a half or so, where it's helped land us in our research group to some national platforms for presentations and projects. So if you remember nothing else, because it's the end of this afternoon, remember that SlicerDicer is a cohort creator. And the idea here is in the next 5 to 10 minutes, we'll go through what SlicerDicer is, how it can help you, and how it can be used for kind of as a step off point for clinical research, sort of with what Dr. Hobson-Webb was mentioning as kind of that first step. I double checked the numbers here last night. It looks like SlicerDicer for Duke represents about 5.2 million patients at this time. These slides are old from a colleague of mine from 2018. But the idea is that we use SlicerDicer to put a magnifying glass on the 5.2 million patients seen at Duke since the EPIC was implemented in 2013. Correct. It is all embedded within EPIC, and to create your own cohort that you want to look at with a little bit more detail. It is EPIC proprietary, as Rich mentioned, and what it brings back are patient-centric cohorts, and I'll show you what that means here in a second. The nice thing is it's a self-service. So sometimes if there's clinic downtime, or if I'm having a conversation with a fellow on certain things that we're seeing, we can answer a quick clinical question to say, hey, how often does that really happen? Or how many patients do we see with X diagnosis? And I'll show you what that looks like in a bit. How to get there. I finished clinic at 4:58 p.m. today, so I'm not too excited about logging back onto EPIC. So these slides are available, but on the big red EPIC button at the top left, if you click EPIC, then reports, there is SlicerDicer. And then I'll share with you at the very end of today's talk resources on how to remind yourself of how to get there and use it. This is what the interface looks like. And as I mentioned, this is old data on these slides here, but it slices from all patients seen at Duke according to certain parameters that we set as the user. And if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, zoomed in there are criteria that we can use that slice amongst many different things: demographics, encounter reports, history, medical history input, vitals, labs, where the patient was seen, whether it was inpatient or outpatient, and then certain diagnostic terminology where it cross-references against both ICD-10 coding, SNOMED coding, and then CPT coding for procedures that were offered, services offered to the patient. What it helps us do, and what's helped me do, is create registries, help as a step-off point for creating databases, and ask clinical questions to kind of get a quick answer at a large scale level, not at a granular level. This is what the box looks like when you try to click the criteria, and you can start to just see, this is a scroll box, what kind of details that you can try to slice from SlicerDicer. And as I'm sure many of you experience, when you see something like this, the clinical questions come up. What diagnoses do I want to slice by? What are all the patients at Duke that have X, have been immunized for X, with a diagnosis of X? And there's layers here. And these are all the many, many cohort filters. I've not an exhaustive list. There are encounter filters. So if you want to look at your outpatient patients just from a curiosity of your own patient panel in the outpatient setting, you can look by payer, you can look by level of service, length of stay for inpatient hospitalizations. I hope you're okay, Shri. But yeah, so lots of possibilities here. So these are what the filters do. Since I've used SlicerDicer for research publications and retrospective chart reviews, the key I'll mention here is that there is this little I button that helps us report out our methods when it comes to how the SlicerDicer research is performed. For example, if I'm looking at certain medications, if you click the I, the little information button will tell you how medications were abstracted for this query. And I often use a lot of that same language when I cite SlicerDicer as my data source. So why is it useful? I think it's simple. It's kind of fun to play around with sometimes. It has shareable populations. And so what you can do as kind of internal check is to try to come up with the same cohort between two people that are working amongst the same group to ensure that there's data quality amongst the group members. And it's contained within Epic. So for folks who are providing clinical care, it's pretty easy because you're right there. So use cases, this is what I wanted to share with you all today, to show a little bit more of what it looks like to use SlicerDicer. So I'll start with something near and dear to my heart. SlicerDicer at the whole is a really great way to find your cohort. So for example, our group wanted to know how many patients with MS have we ever cared for? And there's different ways to slice this, but at its simplest, I took the all patient population at Duke, which is that 5.2 million, and I just clicked, as you can see here on the right side, for anyone with a diagnosis of MS. And you can see here that's about 7,500 patients. You can add slices, and there's layered logic here where you can ensure that the patients are seen by certain providers within a subspecialty. Of course, neuroimmunology doesn't really show up as a queryable resource, but if you have a finite group of people, we can even take it a step further and say, okay, so out of these 7,559 patients, how many of them were seen by the MS subspecialty group? Similarly, if you want to get a cohort of all patients with migraines who've been treated with Arunimab or Aimovig, similarly, you can look at the slice of all patients. But then there's a couple different things that we can do to help us provide more narrow patient cohorts. And this is where a lot of my review projects, chart review projects with trainees and fellows has stemmed from, is to find this more confined cohort that lends itself to a little bit more easy chart review and to be able to contribute something when it comes to patterns that we're seeing in the clinic. So for example, if we wanted to look into every patient at Duke who has been pregnant and on lamotrigine at the same time, there is a way to query that. And we'll talk about what we do from that in a moment. The other thing I didn't mention here yet is that you can see about halfway down the page, you can put down dates. And so depending on the review you're trying to do, you can set a defined timeline of when this was done to try to be a little bit more contemporary or to cover all the data we have. And sometimes that helps narrow the clinical cohort we're looking at. Again, as a neuroimmunologist, if we want to look at how many patients have had abnormal CSF testing, you can narrow it down not just by positive or abnormal NMDA CSF test results, which are pulled from Epic, but also by the location that they were seen at. And I share this with you to point out a couple things. One, especially in my world, but I'm sure all of us have something similar, there are gen codes. Epic SlicerDicer does not query for that because those are often scanned PDFs that we can't query the data on backwards. So you really have to ask questions smartly, intelligently, to have a sense or a hypothesis that you're testing, a sense of what you're looking for, and then kind of build your cohort backwards from there. What all of this leads to is certain publications, certain ways of representing the data of what we're seeing. And certainly in our world, in neuroimmunology, this is the kind of most large-scale culmination that we came up with, which was MS3 medical student who worked with us last year, did a huge SlicerDicer review on all patients at Duke who had severe COVID, and then all patients at Duke with MS and all patients at Duke with MS and on B-cell depletion therapy to try to get a sense of what the severe COVID risk was in patients who were treated with B-cell depletion. And again, at that aggregate large scale level, it allowed us to look for signals to say, were there things that we're seeing in our particular cohort that was different than the general population, and provide some age matching there. What it's also allowed us to do is for narrow, rare diagnoses, find certain diagnoses and create a registry or a database of patients. Because the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is there is a way to export this data with MRNs so that it can be the step off point to start building retrospective chart reviews and databases. And we've done this with our NMO cohort, of which there are something around 60 patients at Duke, with our MOGAD cohort, which we just published again on with about 33 patients at Duke. And so for narrow, rare diagnoses, it's a great way, as long as we're coding right for the diagnostics, to at least query those patients backwards and find them. And that way we don't have to all keep lists. Yeah.
You mentioned about the coding right. So is there a way to use type in for multiple sclerosis? But you know, if you label it like secondary progressive, primary progressive, that's how much myasthenia gravis, seropositive, negative.
You can. So you can do and or variables. So it's kind of like Boolean search kind of terminology. And so you can just go through all. We're a little simple in the MS world because G35, the ICD-10 code, just catches all of the types of MS. So it doesn't matter at the end of the day. But yes, if you have different ICD codes, and if that's what you're going based off of, then you can put them all in and then aggregate and push out a list. What it's been really nice for as we start using our data, like for our NMO cohort, is not only was I able to query all patients with an NMO diagnosis, I was able to export that data into a shared patient list right on Epic that I then shared with all of the members that I was doing this chart review with, the medical student and the residents. And so everybody had access to the patient list right away. And that way it allowed for a little bit quicker work. Let's see. So yeah, there's your lovely Epic screenshot. I've cleared out the patient names here, but this is what the exported work looks like. This is actually, again, a little bit old since it's 2018, but at this point, as of 2 years ago, we can now take out MRNs and export them. Don't save it to your laptop, make sure it's behind a firewall, all of the usual research rules apply. But I think keeping it as a shared patient list is a really nice, secure way to ensure that you've got your data there. And then you can put it into your REDCap or what have you to keep it secure still. So with all of that said, as you can see, there's easy ways to kind of answer these discrete cohort questions. If you want more granular data, then the next step would be to export the MRNs, perform the chart review, and abstract the data with the details you're looking for. There's tools to learn this better, and I am still learning. So there are some documents that are PDFs available on Duke Internet that have just how do you use SlicerDicer. There are some in-depth videos and PDFs on the difference between SlicerDicer and Deduce. I think those are very important differences to know because the coding on the back end and the way the queries are done are different. And Deduce is kept updated up until midnight the night before, whereas Epic queries real time. So you may notice that if you do a query in Deduce, the numbers may not be exactly the same depending on what you're querying as SlicerDicer. With that said, I will tell you that I learned in 2021 that Deduce is a charged service. And so if you're doing a large project that you have a fund code for and you're able to store data in PACE, Deduce requires the use of the PACE environment, which is something that you pay for. And for a lot of us with medical students or trainees that we're working with, that's not something that we readily have available. So SlicerDicer allows us to start to build similar cohort samples without using any money that we may or may not have. There is just, you can straight up use it today if you want to go home and play around with Epic. So out of the box, you can use it. There's a video that's available to you at the first use. There are some Epic messages, but this I took a look at again last night, and the slides will be shared, but dataprospector.duke.edu is a website that has all the ways to abstract data at Duke. And there is an LMS link that it'll take you to as long as you're logged on to NetID. That is this introduction to MeisterCare reporting tools. And it just walks you through over a few minutes training on how to use SlicerDicer. There are office hours. So if there are certain questions you're wanting to ask, but you feel like your cohort numbers don't look like you would expect, you can show up via a WebEx at 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. And I've had our trainees go to this a few times. There's a link person within the DHTS system that you have to email for the link to the WebEx, but I can share that too. There's all sorts of ways to model this out. You can do QI work, you can do kind of clinical facing work, whatever you choose to do. And so just know there's lots of ways to look at anything you're doing within the clinic that interfaces with patient care. Many of these slides, except for the neurospecific ones, are from Armando Bedoya. So I'll give him credit for the slides. And then there's just a little bit of a SlicerDicer versus deduce chart if you all want to take a look at it later. Any questions? Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Mm. Yeah, thank you. Sure, yeah. Oh, sorry, Danny.
So do you ever use this for feasibility?
Yes, so very much so. I think that's the great way to use it, is to say like, hey, we're having this discussion and do we think that this is something worth launching off into a project of, and what is that going to look like? Absolutely. Mm-mm. Yes. Mhm.
Second question is, what if I have all these ideas that are going to
I go to my Glutz. So you find your friendly statistician. Yeah, Darlin. They do. They do. I haven't been asked, although I do get questions where it's still early enough where if you explain it and it's built in within Epic, people seem to get it. So it just depends on their experience. But yeah, it's similar to how we often cite some of the statistical services we use. We say we use SlicerDicer. Yep. So it can, no, not an Excel sheet. Well, it'll give you out the MRNs, and then you can export that as an Excel sheet that would be password protected. The only trick is, which is why that was all in caps, is you don't want to save it to a personal computer. So you want it behind a firewall. Yeah, yes. Sorry, Shri, you had a question earlier too. Yep. You don't. That's the tough part is there's kind of no internal check there to say I have a protocol in place. And so I think the right way to use it is you can do your feasibility, take a look at what your numbers look like, go back, write the IRB, and then export the MRNs. Correct, before you look at the individual data. And then Simon. No, sort of. Sort of. Yeah. Yeah.
No, but you can in your epic improvement say this one is better go.
Yes.
You can do that.
Yeah, not SlicerDicer because that's more kind of retrospective cohort. All right.
We in the ADOC are sending letters to people who would think that they- No. Yeah, I think we need to-
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, let me see if I can load this thing. Nope. Oh, thank you. I'm going to summarize quickly. It's called Assistant Professor Dinner, but I would like to say that not a single person has left tonight. I've watched it very carefully. And we're now after 8 o'clock, which is really a tribute to the people who talked tonight. And so I just want to give them a round of applause. And I'm just going to summarize a few. And we'll get you out of here before 8. And Kim, we have the, is Kim, there, you go. We have the memory division breakfast tomorrow. Yeah. All right, thank you. So, oh, that's grand rounds. Is that the wrong? Okay, good, gotcha. So just to summarize, basically at Duke, there are 2 tracks. They say there are 4, but there are 2. The standard is the research-based track that leads to tenure, papers, grants, national talks, okay? And for the PhDs, that's important. For clinicians, I think it's a lot less important because clinicians are eminently employable even when they lose all their research funding. They can just keep seeing memory patients and make a bundle. So the career track, which does not result in tenure, but goes all the way up to professor, they're not called anything different, they're still professors, and rewards faculty for important contributions in teaching, clinical care, programmatic development with much, and the emphasis on the much is depending on the individual, because the medical school has said it's a departmental decision, much lesser amounts of standard academic accomplishments. The way you demonstrate academic accomplishments is papers, including book chapters and case reports, or as Danny said, CDs and things on the internet, talks at Duke regionally, local hospitals, grand rounds, meetings nationally, grand rounds, meetings at national meetings, programmatic development, and I gave some examples. Mark Skeen and Tim Collins were both division directors who established new fellowships. Our own Lisa Hobson-Webb developed Neuro of Ultrasound. Bert Scott had the Huntington Center. Rick Bedlack has his ALS Center. Natalia Gonzalez is setting up a myositis center. All these are important programmatic developments. And then there is departmental service, division directors, fellowship directors, residency directors, et cetera, and then national committees. All these things add up, and there's no one way to do it. People, when it's their time, they throw a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that, and they make their case for being promoted. And in almost all cases, it works. And, you know, you might wonder what this pin means. And, you know, those are both like neurons and people, or maybe they're astrocytes. And it all means like it's a group environment and we're all working together towards excellence. But there is that one person who's gold and has a red heart. And that's the individual, because it still takes individual effort to achieve excellence. They do it within an environment that is conducive towards it, but it's still all about the individual. And like Lisa and her initiative, Kim and what she's done, you know what I mean? We help people do things, but it's still about them. And that's what the pin means. So why should you care if you get promoted? You don't have to care. We love great clinicians and we love paying them not that much money because they're assistant professors and they're incredibly important. For basic science, it is different about getting promoted because it's more of an up and out phenomenon. But my point is, why wouldn't you care? You're all capable of accomplishing great things and you're at an institution that is doing everything possible to help support you do those things. Your mother cares a great deal, although I guarantee you your mother doesn't know the difference between an assistant or an associate professor, but they do know about full professor. Your children care, your patients care, your junior faculty care as you progress in your career, because you become an example to them. And they say, well, why aren't you a professor? You know, why would I try to do it if you're not? Your division chief cares and your department chair cares. So there are impediments. The most common, even though it's never voiced, is I hate to write. A ton of faculty hate to write. So I talked to Vern about this today because the neuromuscular group does an amazing job with young faculty, right, Lisa? They really do. And we're going to have him talk about how they do that. And he said, start small, write some abstracts, some posters, go to meetings, meet some people, and then eventually convert that to a manuscript. Work with senior faculty on what you could write, because as we heard today, they're always overburdened with requests to write, and there's nothing they'd like better than have some younger person write it for them. And then as Simon mentioned, the Gopin lectures talks about how to write. I don't know what to write about. That's where, you know, case reports, SlicerDicer, talking to your senior faculty, your division director helps you get started. So I once heard this documentary on the Eagles, you know, the band. I don't know if you ever saw it. It's a history of the Eagles in 2 parts. And the drummer, Glenn Fry, originally got his break as the backup drummer to Bob Seger. He was in the Silver Bullet Band in Detroit. And Seger realized he was talented. And he said to Glenn Fry, you need to start writing your own music. And Glenn Fry said, well, what if they, and then he used the S word. And Seger said, they will S, but you'll keep doing it and they'll get better and better. And it's the same with papers. My first paper was trash. But you start learning how to do it. So it's an iterative process, is it not, Lisa? It's an iterative process. So you've got to start. How can I set up a new program? How can I set up a myositis center? Ask your division director, talk to me, but it comes from your heart. When I was at Bayview, you know, the Hopkins version of regional, we set up, the reason I got this job, we set up 9 national programs that would come to little old Bayview. And the story I give behind them is I set up 10. 9 of them were successful, 1 was a failure. The 9 that were successful was because 9 residents or fellows came to me and said, I want to do this. This is something I feel very passionate about. Every time there were huge successes. The failure is when I went to someone and said, I think we need a center on this. And the person said, sure, but their heart wasn't really into it, and it was a failure. So success comes from your passion, and we will help you set those programs up. Our department needs more of them. How do I get invited to give talks? These are friends, colleagues. Talks to your friends' division. You know, giving a talk to the movement division at Utah, where your friend is a young faculty, counts just as much as doing grand rounds. You just say, I gave a talk to the University of Utah on, DBS. And it looks like, you're the person. And then you invite your friend to give a talk here. But we also, and this, it's a tough problem for young folks. We need to tabulate a database of how people do this, how they get invited to give a talk at Cape Fear or Wake Med and things like that. That's on us. I love the comment on go through the posters at national meetings and talk to the presenters. If you've got a poster and you're like sitting there alone and somebody comes up and starts complimenting your poster, you're going to love that person forever. That's how you make friends and colleagues. I love the volunteer to do review for journals. Brilliant. How do I get on committees? Well, the AAN has these interest groups that anyone can sign up for. And because of that, they get on these, Vern told me this, listservs where there are a variety of options available to them. You just got to get involved. Databases. Databases you either start or find. Starting means like the neuromuscular database, where you start saying, I'm going to write down the characteristics of every myasthenic that I ever see. Well, that's going to take you forever. It'll eventually be useful, but it takes a long time. But there are a ton of pre-existing databases already in existence at Duke through the DCRI and other places, and you just got to ask about these. And then, you work with it, you have a question, and then you work with a statistician like Michael. Get out of the department for mentorship. Like, I'm going to use Lisa again, but if you work for someone in the department, you're not very valuable to me because I already have that person in the department. You know what I mean? You're not bringing something new to the field or to the department. Whereas if you're working with someone in biomedical engineering, even someone like Sneha, who's working with people in the English department, that's incredibly unique and important. So don't feel everything has to be about working with people in our department. SlicerDicer. But the other important thing is just because you make your own little epic dot phrase, that's not searchable. You have to work with the epic champions to make that little dot phrase you put into your note actually searchable, because they have to put a tag on that dot phrase so you can then find it. So, you can work by developing your own database by working on your databases and then making them searchable. But just because you make a dot phrase doesn't make it searchable. I don't know anything about stats. The department supports Mike Lutz and people in statistics around Duke to help you. I couldn't believe this. I went on faculty development tonight at Duke, and here we are. Is that you, Suma? I know that's Scott, but is that you? It might be you, but it's definitely Scott. But Duke has tons of programs for faculty development, so take advantage of them. And it's on the faculty development website. Will you be my mentor? Anyone read Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg? It's really a good book. I read it. And here's a chapter called Will You Be My Mentor? It was about while she was at Facebook, literally 10 times a week, people will come into her office and say, will you be my mentor? And her comment was, well, what are you bringing to it? I mean, you can't just show up my office and beg me for mercy. You have to bring something to the relationship. And she said, sometimes just hard work. If you be my mentor, I'll do this SlicerDicer that you want done. You know what I mean? That starts a relationship. So you have to add something to it, but adding to it can just be humility. And what can I add? Not that you have some super expertise that they all need. So our department wants to promote you. That wasn't true at my previous job, but it's certainly true here at Duke. Slow and steady is what works. Keeping track of your activities, be curious around your patients, and ask people questions and how they did that. So again, I want to thank everyone who talked, all of you for coming. We are here to promote you. And you know, and along the way, who knows what you can accomplish? So unless you try. So we'll end it there and thank you all for coming. And again, thanks to everyone who was involved in setting this up, and especially our speakers tonight.
Sorry.